The story begins not with the figure of Alexander himself, but with the land that shaped him, and the father whose reforms laid the foundation for an empire that would stretch from the shores of the Aegean to the edge of India. Macedonia in the early 4th century before the Common Era was a rugged and often overlooked kingdom on the northern fringes of the Greek world. The city-states of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes had long looked down upon their northern neighbors, dismissing them as half-barbarous tribes more akin to Thracians than to civilized Hellenes. Yet it was from this overlooked kingdom that a force would emerge to dominate the Greek world, and soon after, much of the known world itself. At the center of this transformation stood King Philip II, a man of relentless ambition, shrewd intelligence, and ruthless practicality. When Philip came to power in 359 BCE, Macedonia was on the verge of collapse. Invading tribes pressed at its borders, internal rivals schemed for the throne, and the once proud Argead dynasty seemed destined to fade into obscurity. But Philip saw not only the perils of his kingdom's weakness, but the opportunities hidden within them. Having spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, he had observed firsthand the military innovations of Epaminondas and the formidable sacred band. He had studied the intricate dance of hoplite phalanxes, the coordination of infantry and cavalry, the strength that discipline and professional training could lend to an army. Now, with a soldier's instinct and a statesman's foresight, he began to reshape Macedonia from a fragile kingdom into a martial machine. Philip's reforms of the Macedonian army were nothing short of revolutionary. He armed his infantry with the sarissa, a pike often more than 18 feet long, which gave his phalanx reach and striking power that no traditional Greek hoplite could match. The phalanx itself became a disciplined wall of spear points, bristling and impenetrable, while cavalry, long a strength of the Macedonians, was refined into a shock arm of decisive power. Philip welded nobles into the companion cavalry, elite horsemen who would form the spearhead of future conquests. Mercenaries, engineers, and siege specialists were recruited to give Macedonia capabilities no Greek city-state could rival. This new army was not a collection of temporary citizen soldiers, summoned for short campaigns and then disbanded. It was a standing force loyal to its king, hardened by constant campaigning and drilled to perfection. Alongside these military reforms came Philip's political cunning. Through diplomacy, bribery, and marriage alliances, he neutralized rivals and bound powerful clans to his rule. He expanded Macedonia's reach southward, subduing Thessaly and pressing into the fractious politics of Greece. In 338 BCE, he faced the combined might of Athens and Thebes at Chaeronea, and there, his reformed army proved its worth. The battle became legend, not only for Philip's victory but for the role of his teenage son Alexander. Leading the companion cavalry on the Macedonian left, Alexander charged with ferocity, breaking the sacred band of Thebes in brutal combat. The Greek world was stunned. Macedon, once scorned as a backwater, had shattered the greatest powers of Hellas in open battle. For the Greeks, the outcome was bitter. Athens, though spared destruction, was forced into Philip's new Hellenic League, ostensibly an alliance of equals, but in truth a tool for Macedonian hegemony. Thebes, humiliated by the loss of its sacred band, simmered with resentment. Sparta alone remained aloof, refusing to bow to Macedon but diminished and isolated. For Philip, the road to his greater ambition was clear. He would unite the Greeks under Macedonian leadership, not only by conquest but by claiming a nobler purpose, a war of revenge against Persia for the invasions of the previous century. It was into this crucible of ambition, reform, and conquest that Alexander was born. In 356 BCE, at the palace of Pella, Alexander entered the world on the same night, it was said, that Philip received news of a great victory. Prophecy and omen soon clothed the child in an aura of destiny. Legends claimed that on the night of his conception, his mother Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt striking her womb, while Philip himself dreamed of sealing his wife's womb with the image of a lion. The interpretations were many, but all pointed to greatness. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was a woman of intense passions and fierce will, a princess of Epirus, She carried with her the traditions of her homeland, where devotion to the gods and belief in divine omens ran deep. To her son she would impart not only ambition, but also the conviction that he was favored by the gods. Philip, pragmatic and warlike, shaped Alexander's martial training, while Olympias instilled in him the belief that he was destined for something more than kingship, that he was perhaps touched by divinity. The young prince grew in a court filled with intrigue, ambition, and martial discipline. From an early age, he showed a thirst for knowledge as well as for action. His education was entrusted to none other than Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, who was summoned to Mysa to instruct the heir of Macedonia. For several years, Alexander and a select group of companions studied under Aristotle's guidance, exploring philosophy, science, literature, and ethics. The Iliad became Alexander's constant companion. He saw in Homer's Achilles the model of heroic greatness he longed to emulate. It was said he carried a copy of the epic on campaign, annotated by Aristotle's own hand. But Alexander's education was not confined to books and ideas. He was trained in horsemanship, weaponry, and the arts of command. One story, recorded by Plutarch, tells of the taming of Bucephalus, the great horse who would carry Alexander into countless battles. The animal was wild and unmanageable, rejected by others as too dangerous. But Alexander, observing that the horse was frightened by its own shadow, turned its head toward the sun and mounted it with calm confidence. Philip, watching his son master the beast, is said to have exclaimed that Macedonia was too small for him, and that he must seek a kingdom greater than this. Alexander's youth was not free of tension. Philip, though proud of his son's talents, also feared his ambition. The court was rife with rivalries, as Philip took new wives and fathered children who might contest the succession. Olympias, fiercely protective of Alexander's claim, grew estranged from her husband. Amidst these family struggles, Alexander's character was tempered by both love and conflict, admiration and rivalry. The moment that would thrust him into supreme power came suddenly. In 336 BCE, as Philip prepared to lead his grand campaign against Persia, he was assassinated at Aegae, struck down at his daughter's wedding by one of his own bodyguards. The reasons remain debated. Some say it was a personal grievance, others whisper of plots involving Olympias or rival nobles, but the effect was the same. At 20 years old, Alexander ascended the throne of Macedonia. The new king's position was far from secure. Enemies both at home and abroad saw in Philip's death an opportunity. Rival claimants threatened rebellion. Greek city-states stirred with thoughts of throwing off Macedonian control, and in the north, Thracian tribes eyed their chance to invade. Alexander's first test was survival, and he met it with speed and ferocity. Moving swiftly, he secured the loyalty of the army, eliminated rivals, and asserted his claim with decisive authority. In Greece, whispers of revolt grew louder. Thebes, proud and bitter after Chaeronea, saw its chance. Athens hesitated, watching carefully to see whether Philip's young successor could hold the reins of power. To demonstrate his strength, Alexander marched south with a speed that astonished the Greeks. At Corinth, he reaffirmed his leadership of the Hellenic League, but in Thebes, resistance hardened into outright rebellion. The Thebans underestimated the resolve of the young king. In 335 BCE, Alexander descended upon the city, surrounding it with his forces. The siege was swift and brutal. Macedonian siegecraft, honed under Philip, breached the defenses, and the army poured into the streets. Thebes was stormed, its resistance crushed, its people slaughtered or enslaved. The destruction was total, a calculated message to all of Greece. No city would be allowed to defy Macedon's rule. The impact was immediate. Athens, trembling at the fate of Thebes, held back from resistance. Sparta remained sullen but isolated. The rest of Greece bowed to Alexander's authority. With one savage stroke, he had secured his rear, ensured his dominance, and silenced dissent. The young king had proved that he was not merely his father's heir, but his equal in ruthlessness and resolve. As the dust settled over the ruins of Thebes, Alexander's gaze turned eastward. The great project of Philip, the invasion of Persia, was now his to command. For decades, the Persian Empire had loomed over the Greek world, its kings ruling from the palaces of Susa, Persepolis, and Babylon. Though the invasions of Darius and Xerxes had been repelled in the 5th century, Persia remained vast and powerful, a colossus stretching from Asia Minor to the Indus, from Egypt to the Hindu Kush. To the Greeks, Persia was both enemy and prize, a source of tribute, wealth, and humiliation. To Alexander, it was the stage upon which his destiny would unfold. He had secured Macedonia. He had crushed rebellion in Greece. Now, with his father's army perfected and his own ambition burning within him, he prepared to cross the narrow straits of the Hellespont, to step onto Asian soil, and to begin a war that would change the course of history forever. The waters of the Hellespont shimmered in the early light as Alexander prepared to step into history. For centuries, that narrow strait had marked the boundary between Europe and Asia, between the Greek world and the vast dominion of Persia. Xerxes had once crossed it with a great army to invade Greece. Now, in a reversal of fate, Alexander crossed it with the might of Macedon, bearing with him the ambition to bring down the very empire that had once threatened his ancestors. The crossing was no mere logistical exercise. It was staged with deliberate symbolism. At Troy, Alexander halted and paid homage to the heroes of the past. He visited the supposed tomb of Achilles, his idol since boyhood, and there he made offerings, declaring his lineage as a descendant of heroes. To him, this was more than conquest. It was the continuation of a heroic tradition, a war that linked him to the epics of Homer. The army he led into Asia was formidable, but not overwhelming in size, around 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, a professional force honed by years of Philip's campaigns. Among them were the Macedonian phalanxes bristling with their sarissas, the elite companion cavalry, the agile hypaspists, and contingents of Greek allies. It was a relatively small force compared to the seemingly inexhaustible manpower of Persia, but its cohesion, discipline, and leadership made it a weapon unlike any the world had seen. With him came not only soldiers, but engineers, siege specialists, surveyors, and historians. Alexander's campaign would not merely be a march of arms, but a project of conquest, settlement, and enduring domination. The first test came swiftly at the river Granicus near the ancient city of Troy. Persian satraps of Asia Minor, aware of the threat Alexander posed, had gathered their forces to block his advance. Their army, drawn from across the western satrapies, numbered perhaps 20,000 cavalry and an equal number of Greek mercenaries. Confident in their numbers and position, they awaited the Macedonians on the far bank of the river. Arrian, in his Anabasis, describes how the Persians lined their cavalry along the bank, forcing Alexander either to withdraw or to attack across the current into a storm of resistance. For Alexander, retreat was unthinkable. The Persians had chosen their position well, counting on the difficulty of forcing a river crossing under fire. Parmenion, his experienced general, advised waiting until morning to cross at a more favorable spot. But Alexander, always seeking boldness over caution, resolved to strike immediately. To delay would be to appear hesitant. To attack was to seize the initiative and strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. The battle began with a daring assault. Alexander led his companion cavalry into the river, the current surging around their horses as they charged up the steep banks toward the waiting Persians. At the forefront, Alexander stood out in his gleaming armor marked by a tall white plume. The clash was furious. Persian nobles, mounted and armored, hurled themselves against him. One, Spithridates, nearly struck Alexander with a deadly blow, but at the last instant a loyal companion, Clitus the Black, severed the Persian's arm with his sword, saving the king's life. Meanwhile, the Macedonian infantry surged across the river, forming their phalanx on the opposite bank. With their long sarissas, they advanced inexorably, pushing back the Persian line. The Persian cavalry, unable to break the disciplined wall of pikes, faltered. When Alexander wheeled his companions into their flank, the resistance collapsed. The Greek mercenaries, left stranded, fought stubbornly, but were overwhelmed by the advancing phalanx. Thousands were cut down and thousands more were taken prisoner. The victory at the Granicus was decisive, not for the size of the battle but for its psychological impact. Alexander had shown that he could meet Persian satraps on their own soil and defeat them in open combat. The myth of Persian invincibility, already fragile after decades of internal weakness, began to crack. Greek cities in Asia Minor, long under Persian domination, now looked to Alexander as a liberator. And indeed, Alexander presented himself as such. Marching from city to city, he proclaimed freedom for the Greek polis of Asia. At Ephesus, Miletus, and other centers, he restored democratic governments and expelled Persian officials. His policy was shrewd. By claiming to act on behalf of Greek freedom, he justified his campaign not as an invasion, but as a liberation. To the Greeks back home, it lent legitimacy to his leadership of the Hellenic League. To the cities of Asia, it offered hope of autonomy. Yet this liberation was not without strings. Macedonian garrisons were installed, tribute demanded, and loyalty to Alexander enforced. Freedom in his hands was as much a political tool as a noble cause. The campaign pressed onward. At Halicarnassus, a Persian stronghold fortified and commanded by Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek mercenary general, Alexander faced his first great siege. Memnon employed both cunning and determination, using the city's strong walls and fleet support to resist. For weeks, Alexander battered the defenses with his siege engines, launching assaults that were repelled with heavy losses. Memnon's sorties inflicted damage on the Macedonian camp, and the struggle seemed poised to drag on. But Alexander's persistence wore down the defenders, and eventually, with the walls breached and fires spreading, Memnon abandoned the city to continue resistance by sea. The fall of Halicarnassus secured Alexander's flank in Caria, though it revealed the challenges of siege warfare against determined opponents. It also highlighted the role of Memnon, who urged Persia to adopt a scorched earth strategy and to bring the war into Greece by using the Persian navy to stir revolt. His warnings, initially dismissed by Persian leaders, would later haunt them, for Memnon's death removed one of the few commanders capable of matching Alexander's genius. As the campaign advanced, Alexander demonstrated both speed and strategic vision. He knew that control of the coastal cities was essential. Persia's greatest strength lay in its navy, which outnumbered Alexander's fleet many times over. If the Persians retained their coastal bases, they could threaten Greece itself and cut off his supply lines. Thus, Alexander adopted a strategy of systematically seizing the ports, denying the Persian fleet its harbors, and effectively neutralizing its superiority at sea. This coastal march was not only a military necessity, but also a test of endurance and discipline. The army traversed rugged terrain, moved through hostile lands, and dealt with supply challenges. Yet Alexander's leadership kept morale high. His charisma, his willingness to share the hardships of his men, and his unrelenting energy inspired loyalty. Ancient sources repeatedly emphasize how he fought at the front, dined with his companions, and endured the same privations as his soldiers. To them, he was not merely a king commanding from afar, but a comrade in arms, a figure of almost mythic stature. By 333 BCE, the Persians could no longer ignore the growing threat. King Darius III, newly on the throne and eager to assert his authority, began to muster the full might of the empire. The satrap's defeat at the Granicus had shown that local forces could not stand alone. The great king himself would lead an army against this audacious invader. From Babylon, Susa, and the heartlands of Persia, troops were summoned. From the east came cavalry, from the west, infantry and mercenaries. The full weight of Persia would now be thrown into the balance. Alexander, for his part, pressed onward into the heart of Asia Minor, securing Cilicia and the passes that would open the road into Syria. The stage was set for a confrontation far greater than the skirmishes and sieges thus far. Two worlds were about to collide: the disciplined, daring, and cohesive army of Macedonia, and the vast, diverse, but often unwieldy forces of Persia. At Issus, on a narrow plain between mountain and sea, the fate of Asia would hang in the balance. The Cilician gates lay behind him, and with them the mountain passes that opened into the broad plains of Syria. Alexander's army, hardened by its march along the western coast, now found itself in a land where geography would dictate destiny. For Darius, the King of Kings, This was the moment to confront the invader directly. No longer would local satraps stand alone against the Macedonian storm. This time, the great king himself would lead Persia's armies, carrying with him the weight of an empire that spanned from the Mediterranean to the mountains of India. The news of Darius's mobilization reached Alexander as he entered Cilicia. The Macedonian army had endured long marches and bitter conditions. At Tarsus, Alexander himself fell dangerously ill, struck by a fever that some believed might end his campaign before it truly began. Ancient writers differ in their accounts, but most agree he was near death. Physicians hesitated, fearing the consequences if their treatments failed. Yet one, Philip of Acarnania, prepared a draught he believed could cure the king. At that very moment, Alexander received a letter warning him that Philip had been bribed by Darius to poison him. With characteristic boldness, Alexander chose to trust. He took the cup from Philip, drank deeply, and while swallowing, handed the letter to his physician, fixing him with an unwavering gaze. Philip protested his innocence, and in time, the remedy worked. Alexander recovered, and with his recovery, the army's morale surged. The episode became emblematic of his extraordinary self-confidence, his refusal to bow to fear even in the face of mortal danger. Meanwhile, Darius advanced northward with an immense host. Ancient sources, prone to exaggeration, speak of hundreds of thousands, even over 500,000 men. The battlefield was narrow, hemmed in by the coast on one side and the Amanus Mountains on the other. Darius's advantage in numbers was blunted. He could not deploy his cavalry in sweeping maneuvers. His army was compressed into a cramped strip of land where its bulk became a liability. Alexander, recognizing the opportunity, prepared for a decisive clash. The battle unfolded with brutal clarity. Darius placed himself in the center, surrounded by his elite guard, with Greek mercenaries positioned to hold the line against the Macedonian phalanx. His cavalry extended along the flanks, though constrained by the terrain. Alexander, as always, took command of the right with his companion cavalry, while Parmenion held the left, tasked with resisting the weight of Persian horsemen. When the armies collided, the river Pinarus, shallow but still a barrier, became a line of chaos. The Macedonian phalanx advanced steadily, their long sarissas pushing back the mercenaries who fought desperately to hold the line. On the left, Parmenion struggled against Persian cavalry pressing hard, threatening to envelop the flank. For a moment, the outcome hung in doubt. But on the right, Alexander saw his chance. Leading the companions in a wedge formation, he charged directly at the Persian center, straight toward the chariot of Darius himself. The clash was thunderous. Arrian describes how Alexander, conspicuous in his shining armor, became a beacon for his men. As the companions smashed into the Persian line, panic rippled through the ranks. Darius, seeing the onslaught bearing down upon him, lost his nerve. In a moment that would define his reign, the King of Kings abandoned the field, turning his chariot and fleeing in terror. The Persian line, seeing their ruler depart, broke. What had begun as a contest of arms dissolved into a rout. The pursuit was merciless. Thousands of Persians fell, cut down as they fled toward the plains. More devastating still, Darius's camp was overrun. There, Alexander captured the great king's mother, wife, and daughters. According to Curtius Rufus, the Persian queen, believing Alexander would treat them with cruelty, prostrated herself in fear. Instead, Alexander extended courtesy, declaring they would be treated with the honor befitting royalty. His chivalry contrasted sharply with the brutality of ancient warfare, and it won him admiration even among enemies. Yet it also served a political purpose. By sparing Darius's family, Alexander claimed the moral high ground, while keeping the Persian king humiliated and indebted. The victory at Issus was more than a battlefield triumph. It shattered the illusion of Persian supremacy. The great king had fled before Alexander, abandoning not only his army but his family. The psychological blow was immense. Across Asia, satraps and cities reconsidered their loyalties. If the King of Kings could not stand against this Macedonian youth, then perhaps his empire was not so invincible after all. Yet Alexander understood that Issus, for all its glory, was not the end. Darius remained alive, his empire still vast, his resources immense. The Persian navy, though deprived of some bases, still threatened the Aegean. If Alexander pressed eastward without securing his rear, he risked seeing his conquests unravel. Thus he turned his attention not immediately to Babylon or Persepolis, but to the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. His goal was simple but brilliant: to seize every harbor, every naval base, every city that could serve Persia's fleet. Only when the coastline was his would the sea, and with it the threat to Greece, be neutralized. This strategy led him southward into Phoenicia, where the wealthy and powerful cities of Tyre and Sidon commanded the trade routes of the Mediterranean. Tyre in particular stood as a jewel of commerce and naval strength, its island fortress rising from the sea, walls glistening, temples and harbors bustling with life. To control Tyre was to control the sea lanes, and Alexander knew that until it fell, Persia's fleet would endure. But the road to Tyre was not straightforward, nor would the struggle be swift. Before that decisive siege, Alexander would march through Syria and into the Levant, binding new territories to his rule and preparing for the next stage of his epic confrontation with the Empire of Persia. In the aftermath of Issus, the Persian Empire reeled, yet it was far from broken. Darius had fled eastward, his armies shattered but his resources vast. Alexander, triumphant yet calculating, understood the peril of striking directly at the heart of Persia, while its navy still threatened his rear. Control of the sea was not possible with the Macedonian fleet alone. The only way to strip Persia of its maritime power was to seize its harbors, to pull away the foundation upon which its naval supremacy rested. Thus he turned his gaze south, toward the cities of Phoenicia, the great maritime powers of the ancient world. The Phoenician cities were not merely coastal strongholds, they were linchpins of Persian strategy, their fleets forming the backbone of the great king's naval might. Sidon, Abydos, Byblos, and above all Tyre had for centuries commanded the sea lanes of the Mediterranean. To control them was to choke off Persian access to the west, to cut the empire's influence off at its roots. Sidon submitted quickly, its leaders calculating that resistance would bring destruction while submission might preserve autonomy under new masters. Tyre, however, was another matter. Proud, wealthy, and nearly impregnable, Tyre stood as an island fortress less than a kilometer offshore, its high walls rising sheer from the sea. No invader had ever breached its defenses. When Alexander demanded entry to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, the Tyrian equivalent of Heracles, whom Alexander claimed as ancestor and patron, the Tyrians refused. They would acknowledge him as a great conqueror, they said, but not admit him into their sanctuaries. To Alexander, this was defiance, and defiance could not be tolerated. He resolved to take Tyre, no matter how impossible the task appeared. What followed became one of the most famous sieges in history. The problem was clear. Tyre lay beyond reach, protected by the sea, its walls towering, its harbors filled with warships. Alexander's solution was audacious. He would build a causeway, an enormous mole, stretching from the mainland to the island itself, across nearly a kilometer of open water. Stone, timber, and rubble were piled into the sea, forming a massive ramp upon which siege engines could be rolled forward. At first, progress was steady, as the shallow waters near the shore allowed construction to advance. But as the mole pushed further, the water deepened, and Tyrian counterattacks grew fierce. Warships sallied out, hurling fire at the works, burning towers and engines. Divers swam beneath the waves to cut the ropes of Macedonian machines. From the walls, defenders rained missiles, while daring sorties struck the laborers. Alexander responded with relentless ingenuity. He gathered fleets from conquered cities until he could muster hundreds of ships to blockade Tyre and protect the mole. Siege towers were armored with hides to resist fire, catapults hurled stones and bolts to drive defenders from the walls, and the mole crept forward foot by foot, day by day. The struggle lasted 7 months, a brutal test of endurance and determination. At last, in July of 332 BCE, the mole reached the island, and Macedonian rams battered the walls. When breaches were made, Alexander himself led the assault, storming into the city at the head of his companions. The fighting was savage, house to house, street to street, until the defenders were overwhelmed. Tyre, unconquered for centuries, lay in ruins. Its people were slaughtered or enslaved, its walls torn down, its pride shattered. The message to the world was unmistakable. No fortress, however strong, could withstand Alexander's will. From Tyre, Alexander marched south toward Gaza, another stronghold that barred his path into Egypt. Gaza, perched on a high mound overlooking the desert approaches, resisted fiercely. The siege was difficult, with defenders hurling missiles and stones from the heights, inflicting heavy losses on the attackers. Yet Alexander, undeterred even after being wounded in the shoulder, pressed on. Siege towers rolled forward, rams struck the walls, and eventually, the city fell. As at Tyre, resistance was punished with severity. Gaza was sacked, its defenders put to death. With the fall of Gaza, the road into Egypt lay open. Unlike the Phoenician cities, Egypt did not resist. For centuries, the Egyptians had chafed under Persian rule, seeing their conquerors as foreign oppressors who neither respected their gods nor their traditions. When Alexander entered Memphis, he was welcomed as a liberator. The priests hailed him as Pharaoh, son of the god Ammon, rightful ruler of the two lands. To secure his rule, Alexander made offerings in Egyptian temples, honoring their deities and presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a divine king in their own tradition. At the mouth of the Nile, on a windswept stretch of coast between the sea and the lake of Mareotis, Alexander founded a new city, Alexandria. Positioned to command both Mediterranean trade and the riches of the Nile, Alexandria was to be more than a fortress or settlement. It was conceived as a beacon of Greek culture in Egypt, a hub of commerce and learning that would in time eclipse all others. Though Alexander himself would spend little time there, the city would outlast him, becoming one of the greatest centers of the ancient world. From Memphis, Alexander journeyed westward across the desert to the distant oracle of Siwa, where the god Ammon was worshipped. The journey was arduous, the sands endless, the dangers many, yet Alexander pressed on, driven by a desire not only for conquest but for affirmation of his destiny. When at last he stood before the oracle, the priests proclaimed him the son of Ammon, a divine being touched by godhood. The exact words were never recorded, but Alexander emerged convinced that he had been acknowledged as more than mortal. His belief in his divine mission deepened, shaping his sense of identity and his claim to rule not merely as a king, but as one chosen by the gods. Egypt secured, the Phoenician coast subdued, Alexander returned to the east. His strategy had succeeded. The Persian fleet, stripped of its harbors, had been rendered powerless. No longer could it strike at Greece, no longer could it threaten his supply lines. The Mediterranean, once dominated by Persia, now lay under his shadow. With his rear secure and his reputation soaring, Alexander could turn at last to the heart of Persia itself. There, beyond the rivers of Mesopotamia, Darius had raised a new army. Larger than before, drawn from every corner of the empire, it would assemble on the plains of Assyria, near a place called Gaugamela. There, in a battle that would decide the fate of empires, Alexander would face the great king for the second and final time. The sands of Egypt and the waters of the Mediterranean now lay behind him. Alexander had secured his rear, silenced the Persian navy, and crowned himself pharaoh in the temples of Memphis. Yet he knew his destiny would not be decided in Alexandria or Tyre, but on the open plains of Mesopotamia, where the fate of the Persian Empire itself awaited. Darius, humiliated at Issus, had not abandoned his throne. Instead, he had summoned the full might of his empire for one last reckoning. The confrontation would take place at a site chosen by the great king himself, a broad, open plain near the village of Gaugamela. It would be there that the Macedonian spear would strike the heart of Persia. The march eastward was arduous. Alexander led his army through Syria and across the Euphrates, pressing into the vast landscapes of Mesopotamia. At every step, he faced the logistical nightmare of supplying tens of thousands of men and horses in harsh terrain. Yet his command structure and discipline never faltered. Scouts and intelligence reports filtered in, speaking of the immensity of Darius's host. Darius chose his battlefield carefully. Gaugamela, near modern-day Mosul, was an expanse of level ground, deliberately cleared and prepared to maximize the advantage of Persian cavalry and war chariots. Wide enough for his great numbers to deploy, flat enough for scythed chariots to charge unhindered, the plain was intended as the grave of the Macedonian army. For once, geography favored Persia. Alexander's scouts brought him word of the preparations, and the Macedonian king did what he always did. He reconnoitered personally, studying the ground, planning every move. He knew his army was smaller, but he also knew its cohesion, discipline, and tactical flexibility could offset numbers. The men trusted him absolutely, for he had never led them to defeat. The night before battle, a lunar eclipse cast its shadow across the sky. Superstition rippled through the camps. For Persians, the omen was dire, a celestial sign of disaster. For Alexander, ever skilled at bending belief to his will, it was an opportunity. He declared the eclipse a promise of victory, proof that the gods favored his cause. The men believed, and their confidence only grew. On the morning of October 1st, 331 BCE, the two armies faced one another across the plain. The Persian line stretched endlessly, a sea of soldiers glittering in the sun. Chariots with scythed blades waited to tear through ranks. Elephants loomed on the flanks, cavalry massed in overwhelming numbers. At the center, upon a lofty chariot, stood Darius, surrounded by his guard, determined to redeem his honor. Alexander deployed with calculated precision. Parmenion commanded the left, tasked with holding against the expected Persian cavalry onslaught. The phalanx formed the center, bristling with sarissas, steady and unshakable. On the right, Alexander positioned himself with the companions, the hammer of his army, ready to strike when the moment came. To protect against encirclement, he placed reserves angled back, forming a defensive echelon. Every element was in place for a battle plan that depended not on brute force but on timing and nerve. The Persians struck first, unleashing their chariots across the plain. Horses thundered forward, blades whirling from their axles. But the Macedonians had prepared. Gaps were opened in the phalanx. Javelins and arrows rained down, and as the chariots plunged forward, they found themselves funneled into traps. Drivers were slain, horses brought down, and what had been intended as a terror weapon became a tangled ruin. Then came the cavalry. On both flanks, Persian horsemen pressed hard, seeking to envelop Alexander's smaller force. Parmenion on the left struggled, nearly overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers. Yet he held, fighting desperately to buy time. On the right, Alexander advanced cautiously, refusing to commit too soon. The phalanx in the center pressed forward, but the Persians, stretching wide, threatened to surround them. It was at this moment, when the lines were fully engaged and the Persians extended themselves, that Alexander saw his chance. With a sudden burst, he led the companions in a wedge formation, driving diagonally toward the Persian center. Dust rose, sunlight flashed on armor, and the companions pierced through the mass of troops straight toward Darius. The Persian king, confronted with the onrushing figure of Alexander himself, faltered as he had at Issus. Panic seized him. He turned his chariot and fled the field once more. The sight of their king abandoning them shattered Persian morale. The center collapsed, soldiers casting down arms, cavalry wheeling away in disorder. Yet even as Alexander pressed the rout, desperate cries reached him from the left. Parmenion was in peril, his wing nearly broken under relentless pressure. Here Alexander faced one of the hardest decisions of his career: continue the pursuit of Darius, and perhaps capture him, ending the war at once, or wheel his companions back to save his own men. Loyalty to his army prevailed. Alexander turned to support Parmenion, driving the Persian horsemen back and securing the flank. Darius escaped once again, but the Persian army was destroyed. The field of Gaugamela was a slaughter. Tens of thousands lay dead, Persian hopes annihilated. For Alexander, it was the crowning achievement of his military genius, a victory against impossible odds. His tactics, drawing out the Persian line, feigning weakness, striking at the center with decisive force, became models for generations of commanders. More than Issus, more than the Granicus, Gaugamela broke the back of the Persian Empire. With the road open, Alexander marched unopposed into the great capitals of the East. Babylon, the fabled city of Mesopotamia, opened its gates to him without resistance. Its priests and nobles welcomed him as liberator, and Alexander, in turn, showed magnanimity. He restored temples, honored local traditions, and presented himself as rightful king. From Babylon, he advanced to Susa, where the treasure of the Achaemenids awaited. Here he found unimaginable wealth, gold and silver hoarded over centuries, enough to fund his campaigns for a lifetime. But it was at Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, that Alexander's conquest reached its symbolic climax. Marching into the heart of Fars, through the rugged passes, he entered the city built by Darius there in Xerxes, the seat of imperial splendor. The halls of Persepolis glittered with reliefs and columns, its palaces adorned with symbols of kingship. For months, Alexander occupied the city, but as spring approached, he made a fateful decision. In a drunken revel, spurred by courtesans and the memory of Persian desecrations in Greece, he ordered Persepolis burned. Flames consumed the palaces, columns toppled, and the city that had embodied Persian power was reduced to ash. Historians have debated whether the burning was a calculated act of vengeance or a reckless gesture of intoxication. Arrian suggests Alexander later regretted it, recognizing that he had destroyed what could have been a prize of empire. Yet whatever his motives, the message was unmistakable. The house of Persia had fallen, its grandeur consumed by fire. Still, the war was not yet over. Darius lived, retreating into the east, raising fresh armies, refusing to yield. To Alexander, there could be no peace while the great king remained free. He would pursue him into Media and beyond, chasing the last embers of Achaemenid power across the mountains of Iran. The conquest of Persia was nearly complete, but the chase for Darius would lead Alexander into harsher lands, through narrow passes and bitter struggles, into battles where terrain and treachery would test him as much as armies ever had. The ruins of Persepolis still smoldered, its blackened columns rising like skeletal monuments to a fallen empire, when Alexander pressed onward. The Achaemenid throne, though shattered, had not yet been toppled. Darius still lived. So long as the great king drew breath, there remained a rallying point for Persian resistance. Alexander, relentless as ever, resolved to hunt him down across the breadth of Iran, through mountain passes and desolate plains, until the empire of Cyrus and Xerxes was extinguished. The march into Media was arduous. From the fertile plains of Mesopotamia and the palatial wealth of Susa, Alexander's army advanced into the highlands of western Iran, where rugged terrain and narrow passes replaced open battlefields. It was here that geography would once more test the Macedonian king, and where the Persians would attempt their last great act of resistance. Darius, retreating eastward, sent calls for aid to his satraps. Though many abandoned him after Gaugamela, some remained loyal. Chief among them was Ariobarzanes, satrap of Persis, who resolved to defend his homeland with tenacity. At a place called the Persian Gate, near modern Yasuj, he prepared an ambush that would rival the defiance of Thermopylae. The Persian Gate was a narrow defile, hemmed in by steep cliffs and jagged rocks. Ariobarzanes positioned his men above the pass, blocking the road with walls and barricades, while hidden troops waited in ambush. When Alexander advanced, confident in his march toward Persepolis, the trap was sprung. Boulders and missiles rained down from the heights, crushing men and horses. Arrows and javelins poured into the column. The Macedonian phalanx, so formidable on open ground, found itself trapped, unable to advance or deploy. Panic rippled through the ranks. For the first time in years, Alexander faced the real prospect of annihilation. Ancient writers likened the scene to the stand of Leonidas at Thermopylae, but this time it was the Persians who held the pass. Alexander, refusing to retreat, studied the terrain and sought a solution. Locals, under duress or persuasion, revealed a hidden path through the mountains. With part of his army, Alexander led a daring flanking march, scaling ridges and descending upon the Persian position from behind. At dawn, He struck, catching Ariobarzanes and his men between two fires. The defenders fought with desperation, many refusing to surrender, but they were overwhelmed. Ariobarzanes himself, according to some accounts, perished in the fighting, leading his men in a final charge. The pass was taken, the gate forced, and the road into Persis lay open. The victory at the Persian gate was more than tactical. It symbolized the collapse of the last Persian defenses. The gates of the empire, once closed, were now thrown wide. Persepolis had already been torched, its treasures plundered, but the pursuit of Darius pressed eastward into Media, where the fugitive king sought refuge. At Ecbatana, the Median capital, Darius gathered what remnants he could. Yet morale was shattered and loyalty frayed. His satraps, seeing Alexander's relentless advance, began to waver. Chief among them was Bessus, satrap of Bactria, who schemed to betray his king and seize power for himself. Darius, once ruler of millions, found himself increasingly abandoned, his authority slipping away with each passing day. Alexander's march through Media was swift, the army moving with a speed that astonished even his enemies. Supply lines stretched across mountains and deserts, but discipline held, and the king's energy never waned. At every stage he pursued with relentless determination, refusing to allow Darius the chance to regroup. It was a pursuit not merely of a man, but of legitimacy. To capture Darius alive was to claim the mantle of Persia by right, to stand as conqueror and successor. To kill him was to risk leaving a martyr, a symbol for resistance, but fate denied Alexander his prize. In the summer of 330 BCE, as Darius fled eastward toward Bactria, his own satraps turned on him. Bessus, fearing capture and eager to claim the throne, arrested his king. When Alexander's cavalry closed in, pressing hard across the plains, Bessus and his co-conspirators struck. Darius was mortally wounded, abandoned in a cart, left to die on the roadside. Macedonian horsemen arrived to find the great king breathing his last. According to Arrian and Curtius, Darius thanked his conqueror with his dying words, entrusting his family to Alexander's care and bidding him avenge his murder. When the news reached Alexander, he was struck with both triumph and sorrow. He had pursued his rival across half a continent, only to find him slain by treachery. The drama of their rivalry ended not with the spectacle of a captured king, but with a corpse in the dust. Alexander ordered Darius's body buried with royal honors in the tombs of his ancestors. To the Persians it was a gesture of respect, binding their fallen king to the conqueror who now claimed his mantle. To his own men, it was a declaration. Alexander was no longer merely king of Macedon or hegemon of Greece. He was king of Asia, heir to both Philip and Darius, master of Europe and Persia alike. Yet even in death, Darius cast a long shadow. Bessus, styling himself as Artaxerxes V, proclaimed himself king of kings in the east, rallying what forces he could in Bactria and Sogdiana. To Alexander, this was rebellion, an affront to his claim as the rightful ruler of Persia. The war was not yet done. The center of the empire had fallen, but its eastern satrapies, rugged and unconquered, remained defiant. For now, Alexander paused in Media to consolidate. At Ecbatana, he declared the war of vengeance complete, disbanding many Greek contingents who had served under the banner of liberation. To them, the campaign had achieved its aim. Persia was humbled, the debt of Xerxes repaid. But Alexander's vision stretched further. He spoke not of ending the war, but of expanding it, not of returning home, but of pressing deeper into Asia. His men, loyal but weary, followed as he prepared to march beyond the known world, into lands where Greek maps faded into myth. The pursuit of Darius had ended, but the conquest of Asia had only reached its midpoint. Ahead lay the steppes of Central Asia, the fierce horsemen of Sogdiana, the Scythians beyond the Jaxartes. Alexander, now crowned as Lord of Persia, would have to fight not only enemies but the land itself, vast deserts, bitter winters, and unyielding resistance. And in those distant realms, he would meet not only new foes but his future queen Roxana, whose union with him would bind Macedonian steel to Persian blood. But for the moment, the image was clear. Darius was gone, Persia was leaderless, and Alexander stood as master of the greatest empire the world had ever known. What began on the banks of the Granicus and was sealed at Gaugamela had now culminated in a title greater than any Macedonian had ever borne. The king of Asia gazed eastward, toward lands his ancestors had never dreamed of, and resolved to bring them beneath his banner. The body of Darius rested among the kings of old, but his death did not bring the peace Alexander had once envisioned. Instead, it opened a new chapter, one even harsher than the conquest of Persia's heartland. For the satraps of the East had no intention of bowing to a foreign conqueror, no matter his titles. Beyond the great capitals of Mesopotamia and Persis lay the wild lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, regions where mountains rose like walls and rivers cut through endless steppes. Here, nomadic horsemen roamed with the freedom of the wind, and here, the defiant spirit of Persia took root once more. To subdue these lands was not to win a single great battle, but to wage a war of attrition against terrain, climate, and insurgency. It was a struggle that would test even Alexander's genius to its limits. Bessus, the traitor who had betrayed Darius, sought to transform himself from satrap into king. In Bactria, he proclaimed himself Artaxerxes V, claiming the title of King of Kings, though few outside his immediate followers recognized his authority. To Alexander, Bessus was not merely a rival claimant, he was a usurper and regicide. By seizing and murdering Darius, Bessus had denied Alexander the chance to claim Persia through mercy and conquest. Now the Macedonian resolved to pursue him into the remote east, both to avenge Darius's death and to eliminate any rival source of Persian legitimacy. The pursuit was grueling. Alexander led his army through Media and into the mountains of modern Afghanistan, along passes where supply lines frayed, and every valley held the threat of ambush. Villages clung to cliffsides easily defended, forcing the Macedonians into long sieges and brutal assaults. Unlike the decisive battles of Issus or Gaugamela, these were wars fought house by house, rock by rock, against foes who knew the terrain better than any invader could. At first, Bessus fled ahead of him, retreating deeper into Bactria. But treachery begets treachery. His own followers soon turned on him, delivering him bound into Alexander's hands. In a cruel echo of his betrayal of Darius, Bessus found himself a captive, paraded before the army as an example of treason's fate. Alexander ordered him mutilated, his ears and nose cut away, and then executed. Justice, as the Macedonians saw it, had been served. He was now the sole claimant to the throne of Asia. Yet even with Bessus dead, the East did not submit. In Sogdiana, fierce resistance erupted, led by local nobles and warriors who refused to acknowledge Macedonian rule. Chief among them was Spidamenes, a commander of extraordinary skill and determination, who would wage a guerrilla war that bled Alexander's army for years. Spidamenes struck with cunning. He avoided direct confrontation with the phalanx, knowing the futility of facing Macedonian discipline in open battle. Instead, he harried supply lines, ambushed garrisons, and struck suddenly before vanishing into the steppes. In one devastating raid, he annihilated a Macedonian force of 2,000 near the city of Maracanda, sending shockwaves through Alexander's ranks. For the first time, it seemed the conqueror might be ensnared in an unwinnable war. Alexander responded with characteristic ferocity. He established new cities, Alexandrias, dotting the landscape like anchors of control. Each settlement became a fortress, a hub for garrisons, and a symbol of Macedonian permanence. Greek and Macedonian settlers mixed uneasily with local populations, sowing seeds of cultural fusion even amid war. Alexander's strategy was not merely conquest, but colonization, ensuring that his presence would outlast his campaigns. The struggle reached a climax at the great river Jaxartes, the boundary between Persian dominion and the nomadic tribes beyond. There in 329 BCE, Alexander confronted the Scythians, horsemen famed for their speed, their bows, and their refusal to be pinned down. The Scythians crossed the river in vast numbers, taunting the Macedonians, circling in swift arcs, loosing arrows before melting away. It was a style of warfare utterly alien to the heavy infantry of Greece. But fate denied Alexander his prize. In the summer of 330 BCE, as Darius fled eastward toward Bactria, his own satraps turned on him. Bessus, fearing capture and eager to claim the throne, arrested his king. When Alexander's cavalry closed in, pressing hard across the plains, Bessus and his co-conspirators struck. Darius was mortally wounded, abandoned in a cart, left to die on the roadside. Macedonian horsemen arrived to find the great king breathing his last. According to Arrian and Curtius, Darius thanked his conqueror with his dying words, entrusting his family to Alexander's care and bidding him avenge his murder. When the news reached Alexander, he was struck with both triumph and sorrow. He had pursued his rival across half a continent, only to find him slain by treachery. The drama of their rivalry ended not with the spectacle of a captured king, but with a corpse in the dust. Alexander ordered Darius's body buried with royal honors in the tombs of his ancestors. To the Persians it was a gesture of respect, binding their fallen king to the conqueror who now claimed his mantle. To his own men, it was a declaration. Alexander was no longer merely king of Macedon or hegemon of Greece. He was king of Asia, heir to both Philip and Darius, master of Europe and Persia alike. Yet even in death, Darius cast a long shadow. Bessus, styling himself as Artaxerxes V, proclaimed himself king of kings in the east, rallying what forces he could in Bactria and Sogdiana. To Alexander, this was rebellion, an affront to his claim as the rightful ruler of Persia. The war was not yet done. The center of the empire had fallen, but its eastern satrapies, rugged and unconquered, remained defiant. For now, Alexander paused in Media to consolidate. At Ecbatana, he declared the war of vengeance complete, disbanding many Greek contingents who had served under the banner of liberation. To them, the campaign had achieved its aim. Persia was humbled, the debt of Xerxes repaid. But Alexander's vision stretched further. He spoke not of ending the war, but of expanding it, not of returning home, but of pressing deeper into Asia. His men, loyal but weary, followed as he prepared to march beyond the known world, into lands where Greek maps faded into myth. The pursuit of Darius had ended, but the conquest of Asia had only reached its midpoint. Ahead lay the steppes of Central Asia, the fierce horsemen of Sogdiana, the Scythians beyond the Jaxartes. Alexander, now crowned as Lord of Persia, would have to fight not only enemies but the land itself, vast deserts, bitter winters, and unyielding resistance. And in those distant realms, he would meet not only new foes but his future queen Roxana, whose union with him would bind Macedonian steel to Persian blood. But for the moment, the image was clear. Darius was gone, Persia was leaderless, and Alexander stood as master of the greatest empire the world had ever known. What began on the banks of the Granicus and was sealed at Gaugamela had now culminated in a title greater than any Macedonian had ever borne. The king of Asia gazed eastward, toward lands his ancestors had never dreamed of, and resolved to bring them beneath his banner. The body of Darius rested among the kings of old, but his death did not bring the peace Alexander had once envisioned. Instead, it opened a new chapter, one even harsher than the conquest of Persia's heartland. For the satraps of the East had no intention of bowing to a foreign conqueror, no matter his titles. Beyond the great capitals of Mesopotamia and Persis lay the wild lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, regions where mountains rose like walls and rivers cut through endless steppes. Here, nomadic horsemen roamed with the freedom of the wind, and here, the defiant spirit of Persia took root once more. To subdue these lands was not to win a single great battle, but to wage a war of attrition against terrain, climate, and insurgency. It was a struggle that would test even Alexander's genius to its limits. Bessus, the traitor who had betrayed Darius, sought to transform himself from satrap into king. In Bactria, he proclaimed himself Artaxerxes V, claiming the title of King of Kings. though few outside his immediate followers recognized his authority. To Alexander, Bessus was not merely a rival claimant, he was a usurper and regicide. By seizing and murdering Darius, Bessus had denied Alexander the chance to claim Persia through mercy and conquest. Now the Macedonian resolved to pursue him into the remote east, both to avenge Darius's death and to eliminate any rival source of Persian legitimacy. The pursuit was grueling. Alexander led his army through Media and into the mountains of modern Afghanistan, along passes where supply lines frayed, and every valley held the threat of ambush. Villages clung to cliffsides easily defended, forcing the Macedonians into long sieges and brutal assaults. Unlike the decisive battles of Issus or Gaugamela, these were wars fought house by house, rock by rock, against foes who knew the terrain better than any invader could. At first, Bessus fled ahead of him, retreating deeper into Bactria. But treachery begets treachery. His own followers soon turned on him, delivering him bound into Alexander's hands. In a cruel echo of his betrayal of Darius, Bessus found himself a captive, paraded before the army as an example of treason's fate. Alexander ordered him mutilated, his ears and nose cut away, and then executed. Justice, as the Macedonians saw it, had been served. He was now the sole claimant to the throne of Asia. Yet even with Bessus dead, the East did not submit. In Sogdiana, fierce resistance erupted, led by local nobles and warriors who refused to acknowledge Macedonian rule. Chief among them was Spidamenes, a commander of extraordinary skill and determination, who would wage a guerrilla war that bled Alexander's army for years. Spidamenes struck with cunning. He avoided direct confrontation with the phalanx, knowing the futility of facing Macedonian discipline in open battle. Instead, he harried supply lines, ambushed garrisons, and struck suddenly before vanishing into the steppes. In one devastating raid, he annihilated a Macedonian force of 2,000 near the city of Maracanda, sending shockwaves through Alexander's ranks. For the first time, it seemed the conqueror might be ensnared in an unwinnable war. Alexander responded with characteristic ferocity. He established new cities, Alexandrias, dotting the landscape like anchors of control. Each settlement became a fortress, a hub for garrisons, and a symbol of Macedonian permanence. Greek and Macedonian settlers mixed uneasily with local populations, sowing seeds of cultural fusion even amid war. Alexander's strategy was not merely conquest, but colonization, ensuring that his presence would outlast his campaigns. The struggle reached a climax at the great river Jaxartes, the boundary between Persian dominion and the nomadic tribes beyond. There in 329 BCE, Alexander confronted the Scythians, horsemen famed for their speed, their bows, and their refusal to be pinned down. The Scythians crossed the river in vast numbers, taunting the Macedonians, circling in swift arcs, loosing arrows before melting away. It was a style of warfare utterly alien to the heavy infantry of Greece.